Hi, Stephen again here with Answer Me This, and we have another question in the inbox today about hell. And this time it's a question about God's presence. Is God present in hell, or is he absent? Will hell be the absolute absence of God's light and love and himself altogether? Or will hell be the absolute fullness of his presence, but without mercy and only with his wrath? Well, before I try to answer this super easy question, which is of course a joke, this is a very difficult question, and a question that's not super clear in the Bible, which is probably why you're asking it. And you're not alone. It's one that I've also thought a lot about during my own Christian life and have researched. But before I give you my personal thoughts on that question, let me just give you the three most common views among Christians concerning this question. The first view that's very common in the church is that God is totally absent from hell. And so is his light and his love and his goodness and kindness and so on. So hell is basically pure chaos, hatred, evil, humanity without any goodness. You can see some of this view reflected in C.S. Lewis and in some of the popular pastors and theologians today. The second view is that God is totally present in hell with his entire justice and wrath, but none of his kindness and mercy. It's pure wrath and terror from his presence. And this is a view that theologians like R.C. Sproul and John Piper take, for example. The third view is sort of a hybrid view, and it's called Annihilationism. And Annihilationism believes that hell will be the complete presence of God in his wrath, but he will actually destroy people from existence. It will be a lake of fire with burning and so forth, but that burning will literally extinguish their life. It will annihilate them, which is where we get the name Annihilationism. So in this sense, hell is not eternal. And you see, this is kind of a hybrid. Call it a hybrid, because hell is both, on the one hand, the presence of God in his wrath, but then you have the ultimate separation from God in final destruction. Okay, so those are the three most common views among Christians on this topic. And again, this is one of those questions that we don't have a lot of information about in the Bible, so we have to do our best to understand the verses God has given us. Again, I tend to take a very literal view of Scripture unless forced to do otherwise. That's sort of my basic rule of interpretation. And so in Matthew 25, when Jesus says there's an eternal fire prepared for unbelievers and the devil and his angels, I take that literally. And I think that this eliminates then option number 3, because it's an eternal fire prepared for them. So annihilationism does not seem to fit what I read in Scripture. Many places in the New Testament, hell is described as eternal fire, a place where the worm never dies, and so on. Of course, is it possible that hell is not eternal and that this is just metaphorical language? I suppose it could be, but it seems to me that Jesus certainly wanted us to believe that it's eternal with the language he chose to use. So option number 3, annihilationism, doesn't seem true to me. Option number 1 and number 2 both sound pretty horrible. The total absence of God, or the total presence of God in his full wrath. I would like to avoid them both, actually. But I tend to believe option number 2 is the right one, the presence of God in his wrath, because of a theological/philosophical reason. In theology, we talk about something called the incommunicable attributes of God, as opposed to the communicable attributes of God, which are the things that we share with God as his images, like love and justice and mercy. The incommunicable attributes of God are those attributes that he possesses alone in his Godhead, such as omniscience, the fact that he's all-knowing, or omnipotence, the fact that he is all-powerful, and so on. And one of these incommunicable attributes of God has important ramifications on this question. And it's the attribute of his omnipresence. God's omnipresence refers to his being everywhere at all times. He upholds all that exists by his power. If God were to blink, so to speak, for a moment, all would simply disappear. Though God has no need to blink, but I think you get the point. So it doesn't seem possible that God would not be present in hell, upholding it. Otherwise, it would cease to exist. The other problem I see with option number one, that hell is the absolute absence of God, is that it smells of deism. Or at least it leaves the door open for the possibility of a deistic God, if you've ever heard of that. Deism is a view of God that created the world and then stepped away and lets it run on its own laws, which he has set in place. And this was a very common American view 200 years ago, which we refer to also as the watchmaker God. You know, the creator who winds up the clock and then just lets it run on its own. He doesn't need to be involved with it. And option number one, this view of God's total absence, is sort of a deistic view of hell. A hell that is somehow governed by itself, exists without God's upholding power. I find that very hard to believe. We believe that God is upholding the entire universe by his power and his authority and his might. Nothing can exist without his will or his immediate presence. And if he is present there, he will not be there in his mercy and kindness and compassion, but with his justice and righteous indignation. So that's my attempt at an answer. In short, I go with option number two, that hell is the full presence of God's wrath without mercy, which, by the way, is probably the most fearful of the three. And so it should move us to fear, to run to Christ for salvation while we are still alive and before it's too late. This horrific picture of hell is not meant to be judgmental, but to rescue you, to make you run for cover, to the cover of Jesus' blood spilled for you so that you might avoid the wrath which is to come. It's like the pictures on cigarette cartons in Germany, if you've ever seen them. By law in Germany, they have to have these terrible pictures of diseased lungs on the cartons, dead children, amputated limbs, and look, it's unnecessarily grotesque as I stand in line at the Lidl trying to buy my Wurstsalat for lunch. But it's meant as love. It's not meant as judgment. It's meant to rescue. It's meant as a warning. Of course, most of us just overlook those warnings, but we shouldn't. It's a picture of the future in order to change the present. And I hope you can see that as love and as a way to avoid, at least in the biblical account rather than the cigarettes, but that you would see this as an opportunity to avoid whichever of these three versions of hell we will find to be the case on the day of judgment. Well, I hope this helps a little. I think there's a lot of room for disagreement within the church on this question, but that's where I stand, and I hope it's helpful. So thanks again for the question.